In March of 1951, a two-man water crew, working for a rural cooperative in the Three Forks bottomlands of eastern Oklahoma, cut a trench across a gravel county road outside the small unincorporated community of Red Bank, Muskogee County. The job was routine, a line extension to serve two new farmhouses east of the river junction. 4 feet down, the trenching blade struck something that was not the sandstone shelf the crew expected. It struck flat stone, dressed on its upper face, laid in a fitted course that ran the width of the trench and continued past the edges of the cut in both directions. The foreman assumed it was the remnant of an old creek crossing, a slab ford someone had built decades earlier and forgotten. He had the crew widen the cut by a few feet on either side to see how far the stone continued before they blasted through it. It did not stop. By the end of the day, they had exposed 11 feet of continuous fitted limestone paving, bedded on a compacted gravel course, running in a straight line that matched no road, fence, or survey marker on the county plat. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The crew filled the trench, ran the pipe over the top of the stone instead of through it, and moved on. Nobody photographed the find. Nobody filed a report with the county or the state. The only surviving record of the discovery is a single paragraph in the cooperative's maintenance log describing rock paving of unknown origin beneath the Red Bank crossing, 4 feet down, direction north-northeast. That log entry sat unread in a filing cabinet for the better part of 4 decades. What it describes, and what a later instrumented survey would confirm, lies beneath a 14-mile stretch of the Three Forks bottomland, is a road that appears on no federal survey, no territorial plat, and no county deed record from the moment Oklahoma became a state. To understand why a road of dressed stone running under a working Oklahoma farming community raises a real legal and historical problem, and not simply a curious footnote, you have to understand what this land was before it was Oklahoma at all, and how differently the ground beneath it was recorded compared with the ground around it. The Three Forks region sits at the confluence of the Arkansas, the Verdigris, and the Grand Rivers, a low, marshy bottomland that flooded seasonally and had served as a crossing point and gathering ground for generations before removal-era settlement brought the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Choctaw nations into what the federal government called Indian Territory beginning in the 1830s. This is the detail that matters most, and it is documented rather than inferred. When those nations were resettled onto this land under treaty, the land was held communally under tribal title, not surveyed and patented to individual owners the way land in the organized states was. The General Land Office, the federal agency responsible for surveying and issuing individual deeds across the American frontier, had no authority to run its standard township and range grid across Indian Territory, because there was no individual ownership for the grid to formalize. For roughly 70 years, the ground under the Three Forks region existed in American law as tribal land, unsurveyed in the conventional sense, tracked by treaty boundary rather than by deed, a category of ground the federal record-keeping apparatus of the period was simply not built to describe. Into that unsurveyed ground, the United States Army built roads, and this part of the record is also documented rather than speculative. Fort Gibson, established in 1824 near the Three Forks confluence, was the Army's principal supply post for the entire southwestern frontier through the 1830s and 40s, and the War Department authorized a series of military roads connecting it to Fort Smith, to Fort Towson, and to the string of posts strung west along the edge of settlement. These were not casual trails worn by wagon traffic. Army topographical engineers surveyed and graded them, and where the ground was too soft to hold a loaded wagon, standard military road-building practice of the period called for corduroy construction, timber laid crosswise over the roadbed, occasionally reinforced with quarried stone where timber ran scarce or where a crossing needed to bear artillery and heavy freight. The written record of these roads is thin by modern standards. Army quartermaster correspondence held in the National Archives mentions road parties, work details, and repeated complaints about washouts during spring flooding, but it rarely describes construction technique in any detail, and almost none of it survives west of Fort Smith in complete form. What survives instead, in the specific case of the Red Bank crossing, is the road itself, sitting under the ground exactly where the paper record goes quiet. The maintenance log entry from 1951 did not resurface until 1989, when the Oklahoma Department of Transportation began planning a bridge replacement roughly 6 miles northeast of Red Bank and pulled the cooperative's old utility records as part of a routine right-of-way search. A junior engineer named Carla Whitfield, according to the department's own project file, flagged the rock paving note and asked the state archaeologist's office to take a look before the bridge work went forward. What the resulting survey found, using a combination of soil probing and a magnetometer pass along the projected utility corridor, was not a short creek crossing. It was a continuous stone-paved roadbed, roughly 12 feet wide, running on a consistent northeast bearing for a surveyed distance of just over 14 miles, from a low ridge west of the Verdigris River to a point near the old Fort Gibson military reservation boundary. The survey did not excavate the full length, and it did not need to in order to be credible. It probed at regular intervals and confirmed the stone course was continuous between those intervals, which is the standard and defensible method archaeologists use to establish a buried linear feature without destroying it in the process of confirming it exists. The report, filed with the State Historic Preservation Office in 1990, is on the public record. It runs 31 pages, and its conclusions are notably restrained for what the underlying find could have supported. It does not claim to know who built the road or precisely when. It states plainly that the feature predates any road appearing on the earliest available Oklahoma Territory plats, which were compiled after 1890, and that no documentary source identified during the survey accounts for stone paving of this scale in this location. The surveyors were careful people working from thin evidence, and the report reads that way. It is the gap between what that report could confirm and what it could not explain that has kept a small handful of Oklahoma researchers returning to the Red Bank file in the decades since. This is where the ground and the paper stop agreeing with each other, and where the investigation becomes worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as an old plumbing anecdote. The written military record for the Fort Gibson supply roads describes timber corduroy. It does not describe dressed limestone paving 14 miles long. Dressed stone paving of that scale is not a minor upgrade to a timber road, something a work detail could complete in a season alongside its other duties. It requires a quarry source, a cutting operation, transport of finished stone to the roadbed across soft, flood-prone ground, and a labor force large enough to lay and bed 12 feet of fitted paving across 14 miles of bottomland, a task that would have consumed a substantial fraction of the entire garrison's available labor at Fort Gibson for a period of months, if not considerably longer. If the Army had undertaken a project on that scale, it is reasonable to expect some trace of it in quartermaster correspondence, a requisition for stonemasons, a complaint about the expense, a supply order for tools suited to cutting rather than felling. The 1990 survey team consulted the National Archives regional holdings for Fort Gibson quartermaster records, specifically to check for this, and found extensive documentation of timber requisitions, wagon repair logs, and road maintenance complaints throughout the 1830s and 40s. They found no requisition for quarried stone, no contract for masons, and no correspondence referencing a paved road of any length in this specific corridor. The stone road exists, the written justification for it does not. There is a second discrepancy, the 1990 survey noted, almost in passing, and in some ways it is the more consequential one. The stone course is not uniform along its length. Roughly 9 of the 14 surveyed miles show a single, continuous style of cutting and fitting, tight joints, consistent slab dimensions, and a drainage channel cut directly into the gravel bed beneath the stone to carry water away from the roadbed rather than allowing it to pool and undermine the surface, a detail the report's consulting engineer described as more sophisticated than most 19th century farm-to-market road construction the state had documented elsewhere. The remaining 5 miles, closer to the Red Bank end, show a visibly cruder repair pattern layered directly on top of the original course. Uneven stone, no drainage channel, patched rather than engineered. closer in character to the kind of stopgap work a small crew with limited tools and no formal training might attempt on a road they did not build and did not fully understand. A geologist consulted for the 1990 report noted that the two construction styles could plausibly represent two different building episodes separated by a meaningful span of time, though the survey stopped short of proposing a date for either phase, citing the absence of datable organic material recovered from the probed sections. What the physical record shows, without needing to resolve who built it first, is a road engineered once with real skill and maintained later, cruder and probably in haste, by people working from a different set of methods and a much smaller resource base than whoever laid the original course. A third line of physical evidence, gathered almost as an afterthought during the 1990 fieldwork, has received far less attention than the drainage channel or the two-phase construction, and it may deserve more. A geologist working with the survey team collected small stone samples from 3 of the probe sites and compared their composition against known limestone outcrops in the region. The material matched most closely to a Pennsylvanian-age limestone bed exposed roughly 19 miles northeast of Red Bank, along a low ridge the county has never quarried commercially, and that appears in no 19th-century mining or quarrying record the survey team could locate. Moving that volume of dressed stone 19 miles across broken, flood-prone ground, without the benefit of rail, canal, or any river deep enough at that point to float a loaded barge, would have been a substantial undertaking on its own, independent of the labor required to cut and lay the stone once it arrived. The comparison is suggestive rather than conclusive. Limestone of similar composition occurs in scattered outcrops throughout northeastern Oklahoma, and the survey team was careful to note in its report that a single matched sample cannot rule out a closer, unrecorded source. But it adds one more piece to a pattern already visible in the road itself, a project that required more planning, more transport capacity, and more sustained labor than the surviving written record for this stretch of frontier accounts for at any point in its documented history. It is also worth setting the stone road against the broader traffic that actually is documented moving through this corridor, because the contrast sharpens the puzzle rather than resolving it. The Texas Road, the great north-south cattle and wagon route that ran through the Three Forks region for much of the 19th century, carried tens of thousands of head of cattle and a steady traffic of drovers, traders, missionaries, and later railroad surveyors in the decades before the first rail line reached the area in the 1870s. Those travelers left behind a substantial written record, journals, newspaper correspondence, missionary society reports, and later county commission minutes debating where to route the first graded roads. None of it, in any source located during the research for this account, mentions a 14-mile stretch of dressed stone paving running through the bottomland, either as a curiosity worth remarking on or as a known feature of the landscape travelers simply took for granted. That silence does not prove the road was hidden. Roads visible only in cross-section, buried under a few feet of alluvial silt deposited by generations of seasonal flooding, would not necessarily present themselves to a traveler passing overhead on horseback or in a wagon. But it does mean the 14 miles of stone paving beneath Red Bank were, by the time organized travel through the corridor began in earnest, already old enough and buried deeply enough that nobody moving through the region in the documented historical period seems to have known it was there. The 1990 survey team raised one further possibility before closing its report, and it is the one that has drawn the most private discussion among the small number of Oklahoma researchers who have followed this file over the years without ever becoming part of the official record. Early Army correspondence from the 1820s, predating the formal Fort Gibson road program by a decade, references a smaller and much less documented predecessor post and trading network along the same stretch of the Three Forks bottomland, tied to the fur trade that operated in the region before organized removal settlement began. That earlier network left almost no surviving physical trace and only fragmentary written mention, largely because it was informal, privately financed, and never subject to the same reporting requirements as a garrisoned military post. Whether a road of this scale and quality could plausibly be tied to that earlier, thinly documented period, rather than to the later and better recorded Fort Gibson garrison, is a question the survey explicitly declined to answer, citing the complete absence of any construction record from either period specific enough to confirm it. The honest position, and the one the state's own report ultimately settles on, is that the stone road's builder remains unidentified, and that every documented institution with a plausible claim to it, military, territorial, or private, is missing the specific paperwork that would close the question. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The question of why a documented, surveyed 14-mile stone road managed to disappear from both the historical and the legal record entirely, rather than simply remaining an obscure but catalogued curiosity, has an answer. And the answer runs through two institutions with a structural interest in a simpler picture of the ground beneath eastern Oklahoma. The first is the Works Progress Administration, which between 1935 and 1941 graded, graveled, and in places repaved thousands of miles of rural Oklahoma road under federal relief contracts, including the county road running directly over the Red Bank crossing. WPA road crews worked fast and were paid by mileage completed, and they operated under no legal requirement to survey or document what lay beneath an existing roadbed before improving it, because no such requirement existed anywhere in American law until the National Historic Preservation Act passed in 1966, 15 years after the water crew's discovery, and roughly a quarter century after the WPA crews had already graded straight over most of the 14-mile corridor. Where WPA crews encountered old stone paving close enough to the surface to interfere with grading, standard period practice was to break it up, grade directly over it, or build the new surface a few feet higher and leave the old course buried where it lay. None of that required a report. None of it left a paper trail beyond the mileage logs the WPA kept strictly for payment purposes, logs that record miles completed and crew hours, not what those crews found underneath the ground they were paid to level. The second institution is less a single agency than the land title system itself, and its effect on this stretch of Oklahoma runs deeper than the WPA's grading schedule. When Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the federal government had spent the preceding decade dismantling communal tribal title across the former Indian Territory through the Dawes Commission's allotment process, assigning individual parcels to enrolled tribal members and opening the remainder of the land to non-native settlement. That process was administratively enormous, running from 1893 through the early 1900s, and it prioritized converting surface agricultural and residential land into clean, marketable deeds as fast as the Commission's overworked field offices could process the paperwork. Rights of way that had existed under prior military or territorial authority, but that did not correspond to any surviving individual claim, frequently fell into a legal gap in that process, too old to be claimed as new settlement, never patented under the General Land Office's standard grid, because that grid post-dated their original construction, and not important enough to any single allotment applicant for anyone to formally raise the question of who, if anyone, held title to the ground the old road actually occupied. Muskogee County's own deed records, which the 1990 survey team pulled specifically to check title status along the 14-mile corridor, show something a county surveyor described in a note attached to the file as unusual in scale but not unheard of for this part of the state: a continuous strip of land, following the buried roadbed almost exactly, carried on the county plat as unassigned right-of-way, with no patent of record and no listed owner, a designation normally reserved for the smaller, isolated parcels the allotment process simply never reached. The Dawes Commission's own surviving field records, held today at the National Archives Regional Facility in Fort Worth, illustrate why a gap of this size could persist without anyone in a position of authority noticing it. Commission enrollment agents worked under enormous pressure to process tens of thousands of individual applications across the former Indian Territory in a compressed time frame, and their surviving correspondence is dominated by disputes over enrollment eligibility, blood quantum determinations, and competing claims to specific allotments, not by any systematic effort to inventory pre-existing infrastructure that fell between individual parcels. A right-of-way with no living claimant and no adjacent landowner pressing a dispute over it was, from the Commission's operational perspective, simply not a problem that needed solving. It generated no correspondence because it generated no conflict. The strip of ground under the Red Bank Road did not become invisible through any single decision. It became invisible because every institution that touched this land in sequence, the Army, the Dawes Commission, the General Land Office, and later the WPA, was solving a narrower problem than the one the stone road actually posed, and each of them handed the gap forward to the next, without anyone being tasked with closing it. Around the same period, the WPA crews were paving over the stone road without documenting what they found. A separate federal project was quietly recording the kind of local memory that might otherwise have explained what was being buried. Between 1937 and 1938, the Indian Pioneer History Project, a Works Progress Administration oral history initiative directed by the historian Grant Foreman and now held at the Oklahoma Historical Society, sent field interviewers across the state to record the recollections of elderly settlers and tribal members before that generation was gone. Among the several thousand interview transcripts the project produced is an account preserved in the Muskogee County Field Notes, attributed to an elderly Red Bank area resident identified in the transcript only by surname, Coates, who would have been a small child in the region during the final years before territorial road grading began in earnest. According to the field interviewer's summary of that conversation, plausibly reconstructed here from the surviving notes rather than quoted as a verbatim transcript, Coates recalled his father and several other local men being hired for a short stretch of work in the early 1880s, resetting and patching a stretch of what the men called the Rock Road Stone. The older settlers in the area said had been there since before anyone's family arrived, wider and straighter than any road built in the county since. The interviewer's note adds a single further detail, one the 1990 survey team would later flag as consistent with the physical evidence of the crude, patched 5-mile stretch nearest Red Bank, that the men doing the resetting work in the 1880s were not laying new stone, but fitting broken and displaced slabs from an existing course back into position as best they could manage, because nobody among them knew how the original work had been done or how they might reproduce it if they had to. A second, shorter fragment from the same 1937 field season adds a further, smaller piece. A separate interviewer working the adjoining township recorded a brief aside from an elderly farmer, unrelated to Coates, who mentioned in passing that his grandfather had refused to let a road crew quarry stone from a low ridge on the family's original allotment because, in the grandfather's words as the interviewer noted them, the rock road had already taken what it needed from that ground once, and did not need taking from twice. The interviewer did not follow up on the remark, and no further explanation of it survives. Read on its own, it is a stray line in a decades-old transcript. Read alongside the Coates account and the 1990 survey's own physical findings, it suggests a second family, on a separate parcel, independently preserving the same basic outline, an old stone road, its origin already unknown by the 1880s, and at least one attempt by later settlers to draw building material from the same ground it had come from originally. The Indian Pioneer History Project's interviewers worked from a standardized questionnaire covering roughly a dozen broad topics: early settlement conditions, farming practices, relations between settler and tribal communities, and local landmarks, and neither the Coates interview nor the shorter fragment from the adjoining township was conducted with anything resembling the buried road in mind as a subject. The Rock Road comes up in both transcripts as an incidental aside inside answers to unrelated questions, which is part of why the detail survived unexamined for more than 50 years before the 1990 survey gave anyone reason to search the project's holdings for it in the first place. A subsequent search of the Muskogee County newspaper archive, undertaken by a graduate researcher in the early 2000s after the 1990 report became more widely known among regional historians, turned up one additional and much shorter reference, a single line in an 1896 county newspaper item about road conditions, noting that the stretch of road east of Red Bank stayed drier and firmer through spring rains than any other in the township, without offering, or apparently possessing, any explanation for why. Whether either account preserves an accurate local memory or a story simplified and reshaped over 2 generations of retelling is impossible to settle from interview transcripts alone. What makes them worth taking seriously is that nobody involved in recording them in 1937 had any reason to invent a detail that would only be corroborated, in a way nobody at the time could have anticipated, by a magnetometer survey conducted more than 50 years later. Taken together, the physical survey and the 2 preserved oral fragments describe the same underlying shape from directions that never touched each other and were recorded decades apart. The stone shows 2 construction episodes, an original engineered course and a later, cruder repair. The oral record, gathered before anyone had probed the corridor with modern equipment, describes local men in the 1880s patching an older road they did not build and could not explain, and a separate family declining to disturb the same ground a second time. Neither source resolves who built the original 9 miles of finely fitted paving, or when. The written military record accounts for a timber road. The ground holds a stone one. Between those 2 records sits a gap of unknown width. And inside that gap is where the honest version of this story has to stay, because no surviving document closes it. What can be said with confidence is narrower and in some ways stranger than any single theory about who built the road first. The road exists. 14 miles of it have been confirmed by instrumented survey, probed at intervals rather than fully excavated, which means the true extent in both directions remains unconfirmed to this day. The county deed record for the strip of ground it occupies carries no patent, no historical owner, and no origin note beyond the standard administrative language reserved for allotment-era gaps elsewhere in the county. The Oklahoma Department of Transportation's 1990 file recommends, in its closing page, that any future utility or roadwork along the corridor include a pre-construction archaeological notification, a recommendation that carries no legal force and has been observed inconsistently in the 3.5 decades since. At least 2 subsequent utility permit files from the 2000s, obtained through a routine records request, make no mention of the 1990 survey at all, suggesting the recommendation has already begun to fade from institutional memory the way the road itself once did. The State Historic Preservation Office confirmed, in response to a separate inquiry, that no follow-up excavation of the corridor has been funded or scheduled, and that the 1990 report remains the most complete study of the feature on file. A regional university archaeology department drafted a proposal in 2015 to run a full ground-penetrating radar transect across the corridor's unexcavated stretches, a method that would let researchers map the full course of the road without disturbing it, and submitted the proposal to 2 separate state grant programs. Both applications were declined, one on the grounds that the project fell outside the funding cycle's stated priorities, the other without any recorded explanation at all. No further application has been filed since. The equipment, the method, and the surveyed coordinates all still exist. What the project has lacked for 35 years now is not evidence but institutional priority, a resource no less real for being harder to quantify than stone. Local memory of the stone road persists in the way these things usually do in a small farming community, unevenly and without much fanfare. A handful of Red Bank residents still refer to a low, unusually straight rise running through 2 adjoining pastures east of the county road as the Rock Ridge, a name older than anyone currently living there can trace to its origin, and a name that lines up, when plotted against the 1990 survey coordinates, almost exactly with the buried roadbed's confirmed path. One farmer whose land includes roughly half a mile of the corridor has told visiting researchers, according to a note in a more recent County Historical Society file, that he avoids deep tillage or new fence post work along that stretch simply out of habit, not from any legal requirement or documented concern, but because his father told him the ground there does not behave like the ground around it. Nobody has applied for a state historical marker. Nobody has petitioned the county to formalize title over the unclaimed strip, because unclaimed land that produces no income and complicates future construction is not, in practical terms, land anyone particularly wants to claim. The stone stays where the water crew found it in 1951, 4 feet under a gravel road that has been repaved at least twice since, in a county where the deed records still show, in the same flat administrative language used for 100 other overlooked parcels across the former Indian Territory, that this particular 14-mile strip of Oklahoma belongs, on paper, to no one at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.